Namaste and welcome to today's 3:30 show, which is a little bit different. It's not a solo because I've got Professor Salvatore Babones right from Sydney, and it's 9 p.m. in Sydney right now. Welcome, Salvatore. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's great to be here.
And you become quite a celebrity right now in India, and
It,
you've some given epithets and some self-anointed epithets, like you like to call yourself the Khan market gangster, I believe.
well,
And
the first place I went when I visited Delhi was the Khan Market to go buy books. If that doesn't make me a Khan Market gangster, I don't know what that makes me.
oh well, even I did that. That's I think just after 2019 elections, I went to Khan market and I said, "Okay, occupy Khan market." and, and I took a photograph and I tweeted about it, and we had a nice
I'm
fun.
just following in your footsteps, Sanjay. That's all. Following in your footsteps.
So you go and occupy Khan market. That's a good thing to do. I think occupy Khan market should be the next go-to campaign.
We'll get a hashtag going. Call
Hmm?
Elon.
That's right. Okay,
He'll help
occupy
out.
Khan market. We'll do that today. Let me come back to the topics or the quotes for which you are being either hailed or you're being pilloried, depending upon the uh, person or the ideology that the person belongs to. But I just want to go a little deeper in the sense that, okay, you attributed some of the poor ratings that we have. You said that, okay, there is an inherent anti India bias among the rating agencies. And you also talked about the sampling that they do, and the sampling happens among the intellectuals who, according to you, happen to be anti India. Have I got it right so far?
Almost right, except I've been saying there is no anti-India bias among the rating agencies. I want to be very clear about that. The anti-India bias is among the people answering their surveys, not among the agencies themselves. There may be some bias in the agency that I can't know for sure, but the democracy rankings, and I emphasize this, the democracy rankings accurately reflect, as far as I can tell, the views of the people who are being surveyed for these rankings, who are primarily themselves India's own intellectual class.
No, but isn't this a fact that this sampling bias that occurs within the agency may be a result of their own bias? For instance, I pointed out to you I think I sent you an article which analyzes the composition of this, what is called the, I think the Swedish agency, which does the democracy ratings.
Well, so first of all, we don't know the actual composition of the panel for the Varieties of Democracy Institute rankings, which are the ones that rate India the worst. We do know that their panels are composed roughly 85% of academics, and that most of their panelists, two-thirds or more, are within the country being studied. I suspect for India, it's larger than two-thirds within the country, because many of the countries being studied, it would be difficult to find a sufficient panel of academics. But in India, there's such a large number of academic institutions. I would suspect that that number for India is rather above two-thirds. So most of the people being surveyed for India would be leading academics at Indian universities, buttressed by some Indian think tankers, some people at human rights organizations, again, mostly in India, either Indian or non-Indian, but working in India. I see no reason to doubt that that's the composition of the panel. I mean, I don't have the evidence. I don't have a list of panelists, and they're not providing that. But my personal experience from having heard Indian academics, again, senior Indian academics in the social sciences. I'm not talking about engineers or business professors. I'm talking about people who study democracy in India. When I've heard them speak outside India at conferences, and when I've read their writing in public forums, they're the ones who are telling me and my students who attend these events that India has become a fascist dictatorship. So when I hear that repeated back in the VDEM rankings, I'm not at all surprised.
Okay. Let me put it to you this way,
Yeah,
that the Indian academia, by and large, is a product of what we now call coloniality.
sure.
And the syndrome of this coloniality is actually flowing from the West to the developing or the underdeveloped countries. In fact, it was very nicely summarized in a United Nations paper in 1951, which said, I think something like mm, the I think it was called uh, necessary things to do for the underdeveloped economy, something like that. I don't remember the exact title. It was a 1951 paper, which
Mhm.
actually formed the economic development paradigm for most of the underdeveloped and developing countries for the next 50 years, more than 50 years, till I think the 2008 crisis. And even at that time, it said, and it actually put into place the Euro-centric one modernity, one rationality paradigm, and said that, okay, if the countries have to develop, then they have to pay a price. And the price that it wanted to extract, basically, uh, the underpinning is that they have to pay a price in terms of their uh, local morality, and the local values, and they have to conform to the West. This is the coloniality paradigm that has pervaded the world for the last better part of the last 70 years. Uh, don't you think so?
Well, sure. I mean, look, if you want to go all the way back to original causes and you want to say the problem is that when people rank Indian democracy, they don't go to temples and ashrams and mosques and madrasas, but instead they go to Western style universities in India. Well, fair enough. But I mean, let's live in the 21st century. In the 21st century, like it or not, fair or not, product of history though it may be, the fact is it would be, I think, rather unrealistic to expect an agency ranking democracies around the world instead of going to the credentialed experts in that society. That is, the university professors of political science, the university professors of sociology, the heads of the political science and sociology national associations in those countries, the heads of major think tanks. If instead you want to go, to the organic institutions, the non-colonial institutions, all right, you'd probably get a very different answer. But I don't think anyone realistically expects that. I mean, when we rank, let's take it out of the Indian context, when we rank Iranian democracy, no one is going to ask the Ayatollahs what the quality of Iranian democracy is. They're going to go to the University of Tehran and ask about the quality of Iranian democracy. They're going to go to the human rights organizations that are studying Iran to ask about the quality of Iranian democracy. Now, if you want to say that's ultimately a legacy of colonialism and of Western domination, structures of Western domination, you're not wrong. But I think, forgive me, I think you're living in a different century where, look, the reality is we live in a modern world, a postmodern world where these processes have occurred, and there's no getting away from the fact that, the chief credentialing institutions in India, and I emphasize, not just for democracy rankings. I mean, if you want an engineer, are you going to go to an IIT graduate? Or are you going to go to an ashram and someone who studies traditional concepts of, from traditional Vedic concepts of building? Well, you're going to go to an IIT, right? And that's just an obvious fact of life in 21st century India. Colonialized it may be, Western imperialist it may be, but reality it is.
Well, in 2013, the United Nations itself, in its Millennium Goal, it changed that paradigm. It says that there is no development possible without incorporating the local culture. Uh, I put it to you differently. Let's try and compare the economic surveys, as far as India is concerned, and the social surveys, which have higher weightage for social indices, and look at the purely economic indices. And if you look at them, I put it to you that these surveys, like democracy survey, the
Hmm.
freedom index survey, I put them in the category of social and political indices.
Sure.
And when you apply scientific parameters to them, and what is science? Of course, basic science. If you take the Karl Popper theory of how you measure what is the scientific method. The scientific method, they call it verifiability, repeatability,
Yeah.
universality, and falsifiability, of course, which Karl Popper says is the most important. You
Sure.
don't find them in these social and political ratings. Whereas economic ratings, where it is possible to quantify in a more scientific way, in a more exact manner, where the
Mhm.
quantities are exactly measurable, then you get a completely different sense. So, do you
Mhm.
think that these indices are fundamentally unscientific? The
Well,
political and social ones.
Sanjay, I think you're on very thin ice here, since, of course, your validation for the economic surveys is that ultimately you have a hard data component. You can judge the survey against the hard data of actual economic performance. But how do we measure economic performance? We don't measure it in non-Western, organic, socially informed ways. We measure it using GDP, which is a Western construct that has a set of statistical categories that was set up in the 1920s in the United States, and after World War II, through American power, was promulgated out to the rest of the world as the standard way of measuring productivity in the world. And so, your benchmark, yes, your economic surveys may have some external benchmark, but that external benchmark is a thoroughly colonial construct. So, are you in any better shape here? Now, yes, the truth is we don't have any external validation for the social surveys, but that doesn't mean they're not real. There are lots of things for which we have no external validation that are still science. I mean, we have no external validation of anything in our universe because we can only study our universe, astronomically, from inside it. Okay, so but we still can do science inside our universe. And in the same way, these surveys, I have no reason to believe, are not accurately reflecting the actual opinions of highly credentialed social scientists in India. Now, if I'm wrong, I mean, you're Indian, you are much more in this milieu than I am. You tell me, do you find in your experience that the highly credentialed social scientists who study Indian democracy, that is, columnists at major newspapers who write about the quality of democracy, academics at major institutions in the social sciences. I don't mean a scientist who writes a book about the social sciences. I mean the actual professor of politics at Ashoka University or at JNU. Are those professors of politics out there in India saying these rankings are all wrong, or are they highly critical of Indian democracy? The professors of human rights at Indian University, so people who study human rights law for a living, who are credentialed, who are paid by the Indian state to be professors of human rights law, are they telling you, no, human rights in India are fantastic, these surveys are all wrong? Now, if you tell me, as someone who's in this milieu, that I, as an outsider, have just completely misjudged the milieu, in fact, the leading professors of human rights and the leading professors of politics and the head of the Indian Sociological Association and the Indian Political Science Association are all in the news in India, telling India Today and telling News 18 that these democracy rankings are wrong, well, I'll meekly, just kind of fizzle out and go away. but,
You don't need to
but
go
you're
away.
not telling me
I'm,
that.
I'm,
Nobody
I'm,
is nobody is
I'm
telling me that. And, and
what
if
I'm
that's
telling
not the
you.
case,
Yeah, what I'm telling you
so,
is
so
that
yeah.
actually it only buttresses your own argument, because these Ashoka University people, uh, at least people like me, we don't hold them in very high esteem because they are still
You
working
don't
in the
hold them in very high esteem, but
they are still working in the Marxist binaries.
look,
They are not conforming to the
so
millennial goal. They are saying that Indian culture, the Indian basic values. What are the
yeah,
Indian
yeah.
values? Let's talk about the Indian values. What are the Indian values? Indian values, they don't work in binaries. That's it. The
That
logic
is
that the ancient Indians have
you
followed from time immemorial is
you
multi-valued logic, not a binary logic.
you may be right. Nonetheless, Ashoka is the highly ranked, or if not the highly ranked, one of the 3 highest ranked liberal arts colleges in India on every ranking of which I'm aware. Now, if you're doing
That's
an
unfortunate,
international
but true. Yes, that's
look,
very unfortunate.
so you may feel it's
And
unfortunate.
we are working to reverse that. We don't want
Look, you
people
may feel it's
like that who are in Ashoka to
yeah.
hold that
Look,
kind of a rank.
you may feel it's unfortunate. You may feel it's wrong. But the question on the table is, are these rankings reliable? Are they scientifically accurately reflecting the true opinions of the people they are designed to reflect? They are not designed to reflect the opinions of YouTubers, no matter how many millions of followers they may have. They're not designed to reflect the opinions of outsider intellectuals, no matter how high quality and high caliber their books may be. They are designed to reflect the opinions of the credentialed experts on democracy in that country and who study that country. Now, every credentialed expert who studies Indian democracy that I'm aware of outside India, that is, all of the Western experts outside India, seem to be of the same mind that Indian democracy has serious problems. Everyone except me, as far as I can tell. This is why I'm on the program, right? Because I seem to be the only Western expert who's come to a different conclusion. And among Indian experts, we've just agreed that among those who are credentialed, you may believe that they are wrongly credentialed, but we agree that they are credentialed. So the rankings, okay, is the entire intellectual structure that places universities at the height of our intellectual universe. Is that whole structure a Western imposition? Yeah, we have a lot of good world society theory to which I've contributed that says that yes, this is a Western and primarily post-World War II an American imposition.
Well, the majority of Indians believe so. That's why Modi is
Oh yeah,
here.
fine. Look, and if you say, well, tear down the whole structure, I'll say, well, all right, if that's what your country wants to do. But I don't hear tear down the whole structure. I hear tear down only the humanities and social sciences because we like the medical structure, we like the engineering structure, we like the science structure, we like the mathematics structure, we like all of these structures except the humanities and social sciences. And well, I'm sorry, the humanities and social sciences come with the
Comes to
package.
a very fundamental question: what is science and social science?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of debate about that. I mean, social sciences, I think, are, they straddle the border between the humanities and the sciences. That's why they have the qualifier social. They're not as scientific as these sciences. That said, they're not as bad as you may think. I mean, there are other observational sciences that have a lot of the same problems. For instance, geology. In geology, you can use quote unquote scientific methods, but ultimately geologists must interpret what they see without the ability to run experiments on them. Paleontology, similar situation. Now, they're not as bad as social sciences. As you get further and further towards the humanities, you end up in more of what's called an ideographic approach to knowledge, meaning that each person in each topic has its own distinctive approach without necessarily converging on a single methodology as the sciences would. So I'm not defending the social sciences. I'm simply trying to make it very clear that if you want to attack these rankings on the basis that they're unscientific, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. Now, if you want to say that the entire basis of doing rankings is anti-Indian, un-Indian, well, fair enough. But once you accept the superstructure, once you accept the idea that what we are doing is using survey methods and credentialed expertise in order to ascertain an expert opinion, if you accept that basic structure, the rankings are reflecting the opinion. Now, again, you can question the whole foundation. That's fine, and I won't argue with you. But if you accept the foundation, you're stuck with the rankings. Now, as you know, I've argued that the rankings are wrong. They're dead wrong because I think the people, the experts who are making the judgments, are themselves biased, and they're allowing their biases to creep into their social science. They're allowing their scientific, quote unquote, evaluations to be driven by their personal politics. And that's a problem all across the social sciences. It's not so much a problem in geology because very few people have political feelings about geology. But epidemiology, I mean, we've all just been through the coronavirus crisis, and anyone who thinks that epidemiology is not politicized, you've lived through a different crisis than I have. So, it's
Okay,
not just us.
I'll nuance this foundation being wrong versus the uh, people who are being sampled being wrong, and we'll take it to a different dimensions, and that is where your own contention comes in, where you say that people who say that Indian democracy is fascist or Indian democracy is wrong are themselves wrong. Uh, I also see I slightly nuance it in the sense that you feel only the people who are being sampled are basically anti-India and those biases creep in. The people who are doing the sampling are scientific,
Uh,
quote unquote.
Mostly. I mean, I think there may be modest
My
biases,
contention,
but they're very modest.
yeah, my contention is that the very fundamental Eurocentric model that said that people have to sacrifice in 1950, when I'm talking about the UN paper,
Yeah.
and they haven't taken into consideration the changes that have come since then. And the UN itself has gone back on it, where it says that, okay, you have to conform to that one
Yeah.
modernity, one rationality, one universality, Western model. And if you do not conform to it, then you don't develop. And it is along those lines that most of the sampling or the models or the constructs have been made.
Yeah.
But in 2013, the UN itself goes back on it and says that you have to honor the local culture. Without local culture, there will be no development. And what is local culture? For instance, in India, we talk about India. What is the local culture? Has that been factored into their considerations?
Look, first, you keep bringing up UN resolutions. I don't see what UN resolutions have to do with the reality of development. I mean, the UN could resolve tomorrow that the Earth is flat. It won't make the Earth flat. Okay. More importantly, I can demonstrate that you're wrong about the anti-India biases of the ranking structures themselves, because up until 2013, the rankings were relatively favorable to India. That is, up until 2013, one of them had India tied with Belgium. India was in the general range of Western European countries when it came to evaluations of India's democracy. Now, the drop since 2014 has been catastrophic. I mean, it's been enormous on all three of the major rankings. That drop cannot be attributed to a long-standing, universal, unchanging anti-India bias among the rankings agencies. It can be explained very easily and neatly by an anti-Modi bias among the people doing the evaluations. Now, Occam's razor, I can't prove to you that the drop in rankings was due to an anti-Modi bias among leading Indian intellectuals, but look, I know that India was ranked highly up till 2014. I know the rankings have dropped precipitously since 2014. I know that leading Indian intellectuals, are the primary source of information for the rankings. I know that leading Indian intellectuals are largely, as a class, again, I'm talking about credentialed intellectuals at major institutions, human rights campaigners, professors of politics. I know they're thoroughly anti-Modi as a whole.
Okay.
It doesn't take a genius to connect all of these dots together and weave a narrative. Can I prove my narrative? No. I would need a lot more information. Is there a mountain of circumstantial evidence in favor of the narrative? Yeah. Let's just yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the weights that are given to these narratives. For instance, you talk about the hunger index. You talked about why the hunger index tanked, and that was because the lack of correction between 2013 and
Right. There was a
2015.
technical error in the hunger index. Yeah.
Is a technical
That still hasn't
error.
been corrected. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned that. But what about when you talk about hunger index? You yourself mentioned that India's GDP is increased by 50%.
Yeah.
And India has run during the COVID times the largest anti-hunger program of any country. In fact, not just the largest, I think larger by about a factor of 10 of any country.
Yeah.
And they do not get factored into because the weights that are given to the so-called hunger index, there is no access to food weight at all in that hunger index.
Yeah, but look, that's still not the problem, right? I mean, that may be a problem with the index, and that may underlie a chronic situation where India is underranked. That is, it's ranked lower than it should be. But leaving aside that, the issue with the 2022 Global Hunger Index report was that in 2014, the previous UPA government, in an election year, seems to, and I say seems because I can't know the details without the ability to subpoena documents, which I don't have, seems to have reported a far rosier picture than reality, because the numbers in the last benchmarking that the Global Hunger Index did were based on numbers privately provided by Government of India, not actual results from the National Family Survey. Okay, so the previous government provided rosy figures. Now, had the new government come in 2014, reviewed this, and realized that, or even when the 2015 National Family Survey came out, National Family Nutrition Survey, if they had then gone to the World Hunger Index and said, you know what, our previous government gave you incorrect data, we'd like to fix it. If that had been done, then instead of seeing a deterioration in India's situation between the last report and 2022, you would have seen an improvement in India's situation between the last report and 2022, and there would have been no controversy over it. There may have been a minor controversy that India is ranked so low when in reality India should be ranked higher, but the fall in India's ranking or the increase in Indian hunger that was recorded simply wouldn't have been there. There's a technical error. The government didn't fix it. Had the government come in 2014 and immediately cleaned up house, this wouldn't have happened. Now, they let the incorrect data sit there. They presumably didn't know it was there. No one ever thought about it. They didn't even seem to realize when the 2022 data came in, the government of India still didn't realize that the old data from 2014 were incorrect, because they didn't demand that it be fixed. In the government's response to the Global Hunger Index report, it seems to have been unaware. Okay, it took me, and forgive me, I'm just a guy with a computer, but someone who studies international indices. It took me about 20 minutes to realize that the number was wrong, and it took me about 2 hours to find out where the error had crept in. Why didn't the government of India do that? Don't ask me. That's not my job. But this doesn't reflect a anti-Western bias on the part of the people or anti-India bias on the part of the people compiling the Global Hunger Index. It reflects either an error or a lie on the part of the UPA government in 2014. Don't blame the international index compilers for that. Blame the government of India for that.
How do you explain that India is doing so well in some of the indices like the Innovation Index or the Ease of Doing Business Index?
Because they're based on different populations. So ease of doing business is mainly based on surveys of investors and CEOs who have a very different experience of India from university professors and human rights activists. Sorry, what was the other index you mentioned?
The Innovation Index.
Innovation. I'm not familiar with the Innovation Index. Again, if it's based on things like numbers of patents, numbers of graduates, which I expect an Innovation Index will be based on, then India would be doing
startups, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I mean, each of these indices are based on some kind of metrics. Now, you can say there are biases in the construction of what we think of as the appropriate metrics, right? Should a certain metric be used to study democracy, or should a certain metric be used to study best practice? I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. The Varieties of Democracy Institute and its Participatory Democracy Index, which is one of its sub-indexes, it's not the headline index. It includes a metric for universal social policy. The idea in Sweden is that it is more democratic, big air quotes, is more democratic for a country to have universal social policies, for example, universal health care, than have targeted social policies where only poor people get the benefit. Now, the reason they believe that, there's a lot of social theory around this. It's that the idea is that a universal policy is likely to be supported by the whole population, whereas when you have targeted policies, it potentially leads to stigmatization and social exclusion. The idea that, well, if you are using this government-provided healthcare, you're somehow sponging on society, and there's something wrong with you for not taking care of your own needs, right? So there's some theory behind it, but it's a very Western-centric, Euro-centric, not just Western-centric concept. In India, it would be a travesty if instead of having targeted social policies, so anti-poverty programs targeted at the poorest people, if that weren't done, it would be a travesty. India is a resource-constrained country. Absolutely, it should have targeted social policy, not universal social programs. But because of the mindset of the Swedish compilers of the VDEM democracy indices, they've introduced a bias that would lead to India having a lower ranking than it should have, because they haven't adjusted for the context. Now, so there are minor issues like that do result in biases in these indices, Western biases, and not even Western. Often they are European, and even worse than European, they are biases that feed to the preferences of academic political scientists. They're things that political scientists like, and they incorporate it into the index because political scientists.
You can call them dogmas.
You can call them dogmas. That's an entirely appropriate label for them. But this is not the main issue, as I keep stressing, because 2014 India did just fine in all these rankings, right? The democracy rankings, the social rankings. So while there may be minor biases that reflect a Western or a Western academic or a Euro-centric worldview, they're relatively minor. The big issue here, what caused India to fall 80 points in the rankings, 80 notches in the rankings, that's Indian intellectuals reporting that their negative appraisal of Mr. Modi becomes a negative appraisal of Indian democracy, with the implication that the only way a Narendra Modi could be elected is if India is not truly a democracy. They refuse to believe that people would actually want this. And of course, ultimately, you get into theories of false consciousness that, well, if people are voting for Mr. Modi, it must be because they don't understand their own desires, their own needs. This kind of, Marxian claptrap that, I don't think non-Marxians take very seriously. But whatever the reasons, it's very clear that the fall in the rankings has been due to Indian intellectuals' dislike for Mr. Modi. And my own paper is not even about that. My paper is about the mendacious evidence they've given, that the evidence they've given to support their negative rankings has been full of anachronistic information, outright misrepresentations, fabricated evidence. It's just almost entirely wrong.
And that's why you say that the whole trope about India being a fascist state is wrong, and you support it as one of the biggest success story of democracy.
Look, I think that if India were a fascist state, I would have seen some evidence by now. So to put it in context, India is ranked at roughly the same level as Myanmar on the VDM, Varieties of Democracy Institute, and specifically on their electoral democracy ranking, meaning that they believe that Indian elections are on a par with Myanmar elections. Now, Myanmar is run by a military junta. There are no elections. There are no elections in Myanmar. Similarly, if you want to talk about the treatment of marginalized communities in India, so Muslims have been socially excluded in India to some extent. There are problems of Muslim social exclusion. That's why Narendra Modi himself has given speeches advocating.
They have the highest electoral participation of any community.
But there are, look, if there weren't social
that's
exclusion,
an objective fact.
If there weren't social exclusion, Narendra Modi himself wouldn't be talking about the need to be more inclusive for Pashmanda Muslims. He's used the term. Okay, there is some social exclusion of Muslims. In Myanmar,
Pashmanda is a different issue altogether. Let me explain it to you, because I was the one who brought it to the fore. Narendra Modi is talking about it now. I started talking about it 2 years back.
That's great, but look,
there. It is because they're excluded by their own community.
Look, whoever's excluding them, there are problems of social exclusion of Indian Muslims. But compare that to Myanmar. I mean, in Myanmar Muslims have had their homes burned, their women raped, they've been expelled from the country, and now live as refugees in poverty in Bangladesh. Now, again, to rank whatever level of social exclusion there is of Indian Muslims, to place it on a par with the experience of Myanmar Muslims is crazy. There is no comparison between these two levels of social exclusion. Yet the rankings make exactly that comparison. So this is why I say the rankings are objectively false. Not just that I disagree with them, but we have lots of objective evidence. And these are just big picture issues. Again, if you want to read the paper, you want me to get into the details on almost all. I can't say categorically all. On almost every point of evidence raised by the rankings in their textual write-up of the reasons given by their panelists to support the rankings, on almost every point, the point is false, misleading, misconstrued, anachronistic. There are serious flaws with almost every single point. All right, so that leads me to have very little confidence in the veracity of the rankings. I believe in the reliability of the rankings, statistically speaking, but they are not true. The problem is the veracity, not the reliability.
That is because I think we also need to I will do that exercise. We'll try and establish how many of these people who have been sampled are basically Marxists and who have an interest in the breaking India up. These Marxists, they still follow what is called, there is a Gangadhar Adhikari theory, which the Marxists, the CPI as it used to be before independence, they brought this paper to the 1942 Cripps Commission that came to India to study how India could be given freedom or more power or dominion status or whatever. Right. And they said that India should be broken up into 17 countries. 17 countries. And till today, these Marxists haven't disowned that theory. And it is a travesty that they are still not labeled as anti-national and banned from political office.
So look, I don't know the political...
Every time I face a Marxist, I ask him this question: do you disown the Gangadhar Adhikari theory? He never answers that question. Always evades it or starts shouting about something else. They're very good at shouting. They never discuss and debate. They only shout the other person out. So my submission, I agree with you to that extent, is that almost the bulk of these people who are being surveyed are basically Marxists, or should we call them quasi-Marxists? And look, that is quite bad. And maybe we need to not convince them, but because they still follow the Gangadhar Adhikari theory. Anybody following Gangadhar Adhikari theory, which is invested in breaking India up, how can he be taken up as a legitimate, credentialed person for the sample? In fact, I think we need first, now that we know this, just a minute, now that we know this, we probably need to inform them, it's the job of the government, of course, not us, that we need to inform that they have to have this basic fundamental built into their questionnaire when they choose the people who are they sampling, whether they believe in the Gangadhar Adhikari or the breaking India theory or not. If they believe in that theory, then they are unfit to be sampled.
Okay, first, I don't know the political party affiliations of the academics who are in these surveys. Second, even if they
talk about the ideological affiliations, not necessarily.
So I'll say first, I just don't know.
Because even in the Western academia, we know that the Marxists have captured through postmodernism.
No. So Marxists,
they have captured the American academia.
No. Look. I want to be clear. Marxist social science is something very different from Marxist political parties. Okay, these aren't the same thing. So first, I don't know their party affiliations. Second, even if you're right that they believe that India should be broken up into 17 separate countries. For me, as an objective Western social scientist, I'm not Indian. I don't have any passions about India. I'm just looking at this as a social scientist. For me, as an outside social scientist, there's nothing wrong with someone believing that India should be broken up into 17 countries. It may be profoundly wrong for you, but from a social scientific standpoint, maybe that's correct, right? I mean, I don't know prima facie that that's wrong, so that I would have a litmus test. If you believe India should be broken up, you can't be surveyed for this, right? Maybe it's true objectively that India should be broken up into 17 countries. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that I have no prima facie reason to say that it should exclude someone from a ranking if they believe that. Okay, third and most importantly, overwhelmingly, social scientists, political scientists, and sociologists are either intellectually Marxian or Weberian. These are the two big traditions that have come to dominate social science. Neither tradition is fundamentally democratic. That is, both traditions are ultimately German. They're ultimately 19th century German, and they ultimately come out of views of the social sciences that don't embrace democratic decision making. So I'm not surprised that, and for me, that's the determinative issue, that social scientists who evaluate democracy are not coming from the perspective that democracy means one person, one vote, and the people get the government they vote for. And I'm shocked that political scientists as a group don't believe that. But when I read the political science literature, it is now considered a minority, old-fashioned, almost disreputable viewpoint to believe that democracy means one person, one vote, and the people get what they want.
Okay, so it's not. It should be what is called a doctored democracy. Is that the
It should be
ruling
a
opinion?
what?
Is that the ruling opinion, that democracies should be doctored democracies? It should fit into the template of these great social scientists.
I don't know the term you're talking. A doctor democracy? I've never heard of a doctor democracy. What? Or am I mishearing you? I'm sorry.
A doctored democracy is a democracy that is fashioned into exactly the template that the doctor ordered.
Oh, I've never heard the term used that way. No, look, there's a lot of Platonism. People who follow Plato and who want to see an expert-led, a philosopher kingdom led by philosophers or a group of guardians. And it's become now the dominant view in political science that what democracy really means is having institutions that are insulated from the popular will, so that those institutions can operate for the popular good. And this idea goes all the way back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I mean, Rousseau wrote in The Social Contract that for him, democracy was not a vote. He said no vote could possibly tell you what the popular will was. Only the philosopher could tell you what the true popular will is. And if you believe that, well, you may believe many things, but to my mind, you don't believe in democracy. I mean, I subscribe to a very traditional American view that democracy means when we disagree about something, we vote on it. And whichever way the vote goes is the way we go. So, when academics no longer believe that democracy means one person, one vote, and the majority wins, well, then we have a problem for evaluating democracy everywhere. I mean, that's why the highest ranked democracies are Denmark, Norway, Sweden, New Zealand, instead of countries like the US, where despite all the failures of American democracy, the people vote for what they want and they get it.
Quite right. I think they could even rank China as the foremost democracy, because even they claim to be a democracy.
Oh, I have a colleague, the professor of politics at the University of Sydney, who wrote a book about China being a quality democracy, and then wrote a second book about how India was not a democracy because it did not follow the governance methods pioneered by China. There are serious Western academics who are highly credentialed who take this viewpoint. And so I'm not surprised that there are also serious Indian academics who are highly credentialed who may take a similar view.
There it is. I think we come down to the almost same opinion, a consensus as it is. Well,
we should take a vote. Unfortunately, any vote we take will be 1-to-1.
We can ask our viewers to vote. Yes, of course. The discussion
Sure.
has been so fascinating. The viewers are also coming in with a lot of questions. So I will request the viewers to please like this video, also share it around, and to subscribe the channel if you haven't already, and also to support the channel. Now, one last question from me, and then we go to the audience questions. It's
Sure.
already 45 minutes, and it's been so fascinating that I forgot to keep track of time, actually. You made a statement that has been highly flagged. Of course, that statement has been appreciated by a majority of Indians. And you said that the West is thoroughly anti-Indian,
Well, I never
and
said the West was thoroughly
the
anti-Indian.
institutional hatred is getting stronger by the hour.
No, I never said the West is thoroughly anti-Indian, but there are strong anti-Indian forces in elite Western institutions. In places like top universities, in places like think tanks, in places like human rights NGOs, and that anti-India consensus is hardening in these elite institutions. I don't want to say the West is anti-India, because business people aren't anti-India. Ordinary citizens are not anti-India. It's these leading establishment institutions that have turned anti-India. And to me, it's an extension of an age-old anti-Semitism that has hardened also, or there's an anti-Hinduism modeled on the anti-Semitism that's long been in these institutions. Of course, these institutions are all officially opposed to anti-Hinduism, anti-Semitism, anti-anything. But in reality, in many ways, the level of condemnation of Israel that we see among many of these peak institutions, which is now being mirrored in the same institutions by condemnation of India, I find a shocking correlation. Now, it's only a correlation, but it shares a lot of the same origins. So even among people who are no longer religious, there is historically a Christian disrespect and even loathing for Jews that has been reflected in the horrific anti-Semitism, obviously, of the Holocaust, but even going back further than that, of the Middle Ages. And Western Christian societies have been engaged in anti-Semitism ever since the beginning of Christianity, right? So this has been something going back almost 2,000 years. But the anti-Hinduism arose pretty much at the beginning of colonial contact. There was, in many ways, a romanticization of Hindu civilization, but at the same time, an othering of Hindu civilization. That is the idea of the Hindu as heathen, who needed to be civilized, and without the light of Christianity, that heathen would always be somehow backward. I mean, that revulsion towards Hinduism that is embedded in colonial institutions has survived the passing of the Christianity that originally fed it. Okay, so that today we still see a kind of in the secular post-Christian West, there's still a disrespect for actual religious Hindus. And in a strange way, it's now become similar to the anti-Christianism of these secular institutions. That is, conservative Christians and conservative Hindus have a lot of the same enemies as as conservative Jews have always had for 2,000 years. That is, people who stigmatize those of a culture and religion other than themselves. Now, the bizarre thing is that for certain cultures and religions, especially for Hinduism and again, I'm using the term in its old-fashioned usage, as a heathen religion, or for Judaism, with the blood libel, the historical blood libel of the Jews. These two trends have been parallel. They've survived they've survived the transition from Christian to post-Christian society, but they're contrasted to a kind of bizarre orientalization of Islam. That is, there seems to be in many peak Western institutions an acceptance that Muslims are somehow by nature inherently anti-democratic, hierarchical, violent. There's an acceptance that, if you do something, if a Western institution were to be Islamophobic and do something that is disrespectful to Islam, it would somehow be justified for Muslims to lash out at that organization. Whereas if the same organization did something anti-Hindu or even anti-Christian, it would just be par for the course. That is, so this anti-Hinduism has been coupled with a bizarre romanticization of Islam. Now, I'm not a scholar of religion. This is not my area. As you can tell, I'm in slightly thinner ground here. I'm surmising, I'm reading the tea leaves of things that I observe out in the world. This is not something I've systematically studied. However, I've found it very striking that literally the same people on campus who organize anti-Zionist rallies are now starting to organize anti-Hindutva rallies. The same people using the same techniques, often with the same slogans, and in combination with the same Muslim fundamentalist allies. Now, it's perfectly natural that a Palestinian activist would be anti-Israel. After all, I mean, Palestine has been at war with Israel for 70 years. It's perfectly natural that a Pakistani student organization would be anti-India. After all, Pakistan has been on and off at war with India for 75 years. The strange thing is the Western intellectuals allying with these groups. Okay, and so I want to be very clear. I don't mean to blame or stigmatize the Palestinians who are active on behalf of their own cause, the Pakistani students who are active on the behalf of their own cause. They're not necessarily anti-Semitic or anti-Hindu. They're just nationalists. But their allies are very strange bedfellows. And it's that kind of raises my suspicion. So I'm sorry for the very long answer. It's a long answer because at this point, it's something I've only begun to study. But hopefully we can get to better research on this over the next few years.
Oh, well, the long answer is very welcome because I entirely agree with it. So, absolutely. And now I think time to go to the audience questions. Let's have audience questions now.
Oh, I can't read that. You'll have to read it for me.
They'll come. Here it is. It is on the screen now. This is Vivek Dahiya. Professor Babones, do you acknowledge or know that all the assaults on Indian civilization emanates from the non-Abrahamic Hindu, or as they think pagans too, as per how they think civilized Christian Islamic way of living?
I think all the assaults is certainly far too strong a term. I mean, look, a lot of these assaults on Indians and on Hinduism come from other sources. They come from political. They come for political reasons. They come from people who very much are fans of Indian civilization, but maybe have their own view of what Indian civilization should be. I mean, I'm thinking here in particular of the Western professors at American universities who've been vehemently anti-India for the last, well, I'm not anti-India, anti-BJP, anti-Modi, anti-Indian institutions for the last 8 years. Often they're doing it out of a love of India, but a love of their own vision of what India should be. So no, I wouldn't go as far as the questioner goes. There's certainly a kernel of truth in the question, but it goes beyond that as well.
Okay, next. Vivek Daya again, Professor Babones. I listened to your talk with Rajdeep. Are you aware that the people who had booked all your visit to India, that is India Today group, are more anti-national than any other media house in India? How uncomfortable is that to comprehend for someone like you, who is a scholar and is above all this nonsense?
So first, I'm sure it's not true. I did have the pleasure of meeting Mr. Arun Puri and his daughter Kali Puri. I talked at great length with Ms. Kali Puri, and I never detected any note of anti-Indianness coming from them. In fact, they were very supportive of what I had to say. They knew exactly what I was going to say when they invited me onto that stage, and they gave me a prime time stage with a one-on-one interview. And to put it in context, even as prominent an Indian intellectual as J.Sai Deepak was on a panel, and I was given a one-on-one interview with one of the most known, the biggest superstar journalists in India, in order to, that is Rajdeep Sardesai, in order to ensure that my interview got the biggest possible audience. Then when we had that audience, they invited me back for a softball interview with a second major journalist. So I can't abide the suggestion that they were in any way, at least with regard to me and in my interactions with them, that they were in any way anti-India. They certainly wanted to foreground what I had to say. They didn't want to quash it. They didn't want to argue with me. They didn't want to discredit what I had to say. They were extremely supportive. Now, what they do in their other work, I don't know. I've read India Today magazine a bit. I find it very informative. I think it's a great magazine. But, I don't have the same depth of knowledge as those of you who are reading India Today every week would have. Still, I saw no evidence of what you're telling me during my visit.
Anyway, all of us enjoyed Rajdeep getting knocked out in the boxing ring, because Rajdeep
he gave me those questions.
He has earned his fame as the Madison Square Garden boxer. If you know what I mean.
All right.
Vivek Daya again. Vivek Daya is asking the most questions. Patram Pushpam from Sweden. Sanjay ji, thank you. Jai Shri Ram, thank you. Professor Babones, keep coming to the Jaipur Dialogues. Okay. So that's an endorsement for you. Next. There's a funny name, Vladimir Adityanath. Okay, for international surveys and rankings, is there any guidelines or doctrine like, say, ISO with clear instructions and certifications? If not,
no. So certainly it's not an international standards organization issue. That's a technical and scientific organization. But you can download the survey instrument used by the Varieties of Democracy Institute. Freedom House also makes its survey instrument available. The Economist, I don't believe, publishes the full survey instrument. I may be wrong about that. But certainly Freedom House and the Varieties of Democracy Institute make the entire full survey available. And Varieties of Democracy Institute provides a very high level of documentation of exactly what they're doing. So it's all there. Whether you think it's correct or not, you can be the judge, but they certainly aren't hiding it from anybody.
Okay, next. James Amari Jr. These rankings tell two things. One, all these ranking agencies are left-centric, want democracies to be divided and weak. Number two, Abraham cults are after the last three: Hindus, Chinese, Orthodox, Russians.
Look, so the quote-unquote left, and I don't like the terms left and right, but certainly the majority of the people involved in the rankings, both in the organizations themselves and among the expert panels, the vast majority of them would consider themselves to be leftists. Now, I don't know that directly. I know that indirectly, because we have evidence, for example, on U.S. university professors that I think it's over 95% of them, when they donate to a political party, donate to the Democratic Party, for example, in the United States. Jonathan Haidt, the New York University psychologist who founded the Heterodox Academy, he's presented in his recent book lots of data on the extraordinary concentration of people who come from a progressive or quote-unquote leftist standpoint in academia. So, of course, the population that's being surveyed here is politically very much on one side. There's no doubt about that. But I want to remind you, with the rankings, it's not just anti-India. So, for example, Bangladesh is ranked by VDEM about 20 points below Pakistan. Now, if I were Bangladeshi, I'd be furious about that. And maybe there are people who are furious in Bangladesh. But, if you were to directly compare Bangladesh and Pakistan, for all the flaws of Bangladesh democracy, it's very clearly a higher quality democracy than that you find in Pakistan.
Definitely, there's no doubt about it.
And that has nothing to do with left-right, anti-Hinduism. That's just a direct comparison of Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Okay, next. Kaushik Chaudhary, when Chanakya replaced Chandragupta with Dhanananda, it's the other way around. He replaced Dhanananda with the Chandragupta.
I think the
spent
questioner
a lot
knows
of
I won't know
time
the
to
difference.
convince intellectuals associated with Dhanananda that his rule is the right way for the nation. It seems Mr. Modi failed to do it with the UPA associates.
Look, and Mr. Modi should not do it. Look, that's no way to run a university system. You don't just install your own people to try to affect the social sciences and humanities. Whether people like it or not, the only way to run a university is as an autonomous entity that is subject to, of course, its board of governors, whatever the structure may be for the particular university. But the idea that the government should be firing all the professors and bringing in quote unquote better ones, I think would ultimately be bad for universities and ultimately bad for India. It's not the right way to address these problems. Facts are the right way to address these problems. Let's get a factual narrative in. If university professors are going to be biased, you're just left with the fact that, well, it's a burden you have to deal with that university professors are biased. They shouldn't be. It's against their responsibilities. But people are people and all people have biases. And I think it's something that just has to be accepted as a burden society should bear.
Right. Well, nevertheless, many of them are. Next question, James Amory. 21st century Lincoln. Democracy is where Islam and left work together. Left don't talk about Pakistan, where non-Muslim minor girls are stolen every day.
Look, there are serious problems in Pakistan, and nobody rates Pakistan democracy above India's. Everyone's aware that Pakistan has serious problems. And in fact, the entire Muslim world ranks very low on democracy rankings, as well it should. Now, there is, I think, a reluctance among human rights groups to call out human rights abuses in Muslim-majority countries. And that has, I think, two root causes. One is an actual Islamophobia, that is an actual fear, maybe a well-founded fear, that if they call out human rights abuses, if they aggressively identify human rights abuses in Muslim-majority countries, that they themselves might be targeted for violence. Now, we have seen that sort of violence emanating out of extreme Islamist elements in society, and maybe that's a justified fear. The second reason, though, is this self-censorship of, because Islamophobia is a real phenomenon, and Islamophobia in Western societies is a real phenomenon. People really are afraid of Muslims. Not everybody, not all the time, but there's a systematic Islamophobia in Western societies. And I think that many of these organizations, out of fear of being labeled Islamophobic, are very reluctant to criticize Muslims. In a similar way that out of fear of being labeled racist, they don't want to criticize African-American leaders, because if they criticize them, they might get labeled. So they let abuses slide among African-American communities, among Muslim communities, because they don't want to be perceived to be racist or Islamophobic.
Okay, next question. CEO India. Okay, namaskar, sir. I find the World Happiness Index the stupidest of them all.
So
Happiness
do
is
I.
a state of
So
mind.
there you go.
How can you ever measure it? What are your views?
Yeah, look, it's pretty silly. It makes the headlines every year when it comes out, because newspapers love to write about it. Who's the happiest country on earth this year? But it is pretty silly.
Next. J. Mamari, Julia Patra Pushpam Sanjay. I hope Professor Babones comes to Jaipur Dialogues in future too. Thanks, Professor Babones.
Invite me and I'll come.
Sure. CEO India again. Meritocracy versus popular opinion. Most economists supported farm laws. Your opinion?
We can't just do what most economists support, because economists are wrong about half the time. So we can't necessarily go with what economists say. However, I wrote extensively myself on the farm laws, supporting the farm laws, and suggesting that they were the right approach for India. India needs agricultural reform. That's something that's obvious, I think, to objective analysts looking in at the Indian economy. And I think the farm laws were a small step in the right direction, and it's unfortunate that that step was taken back.
Next. Udit Pandey. Christians are majority, so the democracy exists in the West. I think that's what the question is.
Well, I mean, Christians aren't really in the majority anymore in the West. I'd say atheists are now in the majority. But I don't see what that has to do with democracy. I mean, you can have Christian democracies, Hindu democracies. I don't see any conflict between religion and democracy. I don't even see a conflict. Many people see a conflict between Islam and democracy. I don't even see a conflict there. The problem is not Islam. The problem is the specific political regimes that have mobilized fundamentalist Islam in the countries where we see these Muslim dictatorships. But I think the motive force for that comes not from the Islam side, it comes from the political side, mobilizing Islam as a force against democracy.
Kuldeep Badonia. If American government can bring 1,600 Nazi scientists as part of Operation Paperclip, do you think American UK government would have an issue if Indian government brought out truth about Subhash Bose? I think out of context.
Look, there's Bose has been unfairly stigmatized as somehow a Nazi collaborator. If anything, he was a Japanese collaborator, and you could stigmatize him as a Japanese collaborator. But clearly, he was first and foremost an Indian freedom fighter. Now, people sometimes end up on the wrong side of history, and that results, this branding. If all we know about history is Nazis bad, Allies good, and we don't know the complexity of the situation, it's very easy to brand people based on that very thin knowledge. And I think that's the problem where Subhash Chandra Bose has been, that in the West, if he is known at all, which is very little, he's only known for having fought against the Americans in Burma. Well, that makes him a baddie, right, in the American imagination. Anyone who knows the situation knows that it's much more complicated than that.
I know. That's how the narratives are built, because the Palestinians are never accused of being Nazi sympathizer, whereas that Haj Amin al-Husseini was sitting with Hitler most of the time.
So I'm not familiar with that, but for example, this plays out right now in Russia and Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin has attempted to label Ukrainians as Banderists because Bandera, the Ukrainian nationalist, fought in some cases on the German side in World War II. Now, he wasn't necessarily a German sympathizer. What he was anti-Soviet, and your enemy's enemy is your friend. And in war, these kind of compromises are made. You could just as well call America a communist sympathizer country, because America sent arms to the Soviet Union in World War II. Does that make America a supporter of state communism? Well, literally it does, but because we know so much, and this is something I've talked about several times, because we know so much about America, not just Americans, Indians know so much about America, everyone knows so much about America. We know that the American government in the 1940s was not pro-Soviet. It was simply fighting a war, and it had to fight the war, and it did what it had to do, because we have lots of information about it. But if you don't know anything else about Subhash Chandra Bose other than he fought with the Japanese, and that's the only one datum you're aware of, then it sounds like he's a bad guy. When if you know the full story, obviously he was just fighting for his country.
Harshad Malve, 912 million eligible voters, highest ever 67% voter turnout, 353 out of 542 seats won, highest post 1947. How can India be less democratic? Anti-India bias? ?
This has to do with the emerging definitions of democracy in the political science world, where they talk about electoral democracy usually with the qualifier mere. That is, mere electoral democracy resulted in a Modi victory, as if that's no kind of democracy at all. Now, as I've said, I think those of us who have a traditional understanding of democracy, it's the people vote for who they want. And that's what democracy means. But I mean, I'm not kidding. The political science profession has gone a very long way. If you read the Journal of Democracy, if you read the political theory journals, you'll find that they've come up with all sorts of new theories about how democracy works. Many of them have to do with having as many institutions as possible being insulated from democratic decision making. So independent courts, independent central bank, independent health services, independent military. So having everything being not subject to actual democratic control, they are arguing makes a country more democratic. Now, it may make a country better, right? We can debate that, whether the country that has professionalized institutions is a better run country than a country that has elected institutions. But it's certainly less democratic. And I'm a democratic fundamentalist. I mean, I would prefer to see judges elected. And one of the big progressive democratic reforms of the 19th century in America was the argument that judges should be elected. And as a result, many US states, especially in the Midwest and West, now have in America, they still have elected judges. Now tell that to your Supreme Court. The idea that Supreme Court judges
they don't even want government advice.
I know that they should not just be appointed by the government or have the advice of the government. They should actually be running for office. Well, that was a major democratic reform in the 1890s in the United States, and it's one that I believe in.
Okay, next. Mihir. Professor, you seem to have an in-depth knowledge of India and Indian democracy. What led to your keen interest in this subject? Any book recommendations on the subject, please?
I'm a comparativist, and I got interested in India because India is, and I'm going to choose my words carefully here, the world's most extraordinarily successful democracy. And I say extraordinarily successful as a statistician. Countries like Sweden or Canada are ordinarily successful. That is, if you were to study the correlates of democracy, you would find that rich countries, Western countries, English heritage countries tend to be democratic, whereas poor countries, non-Western countries, post-colonial states tend to be non-democratic. Now, on that systematic correlation, India stands out as an extraordinarily democratic country when its other indicators, post-colonial countries, well, every post-colonial state except India became a dictatorship. Maybe it became a democracy again, but it descended into dictatorship. Every poor country with GDP per capita less than $10,000 has not a single country with less than $10,000 GDP has had at least 30 years of free and fair elections with rotation in power of different governments, right? So India stands out as an extraordinarily successful democracy. That's what led me to studying Indian democracy. Where did I start? I started at the beginning of modern India's democracy story. So I started with Swami Vivekananda, but what I really focused on was the independence literature. And I think if you really want to get a grip on your own country's democracy, start with Nehru, of course, and read Gandhi, but also importantly, read Savarkar. Certainly read Rajendra Prasad, read Ambedkar, all of India's founding fathers, with the exception maybe of Sardar Patel. I don't think he was a literary man. All of the others didn't just leave pamphlets like the American founding fathers. They left books discussing their vision for what an independent Indian democracy would look like. Well, go to that literature. That's where I got my grounding in Indian democracy. And you as an Indian, I suppose you're Indian if you're asking this question, if you haven't read your own founding fathers, go back and read them. I think it's worthwhile for every citizen to know where their own countries came from.
Right. Next one, Amulya Mishra. What do you think about Adam Curtis? Although he has not yet made a documentary about Indian politics, but he seems to be a leftist. Is he also a part of anti-India cabal?
I've never heard of Adam Curtis, so you'll have to fill me in.
Next, James Murray Jr. Sir, your question to why Bangladesh is 20 points below Pakistan. Answer, Bangladesh current government works with India. That's why.
That could be, I don't know.
Jihadi free world. How your country deals traitors like jihadi ecosystem.
My country, meaning America, well, America is pretty harsh. It probably will send a drone to kill you. If you mean Australia, where I happen to live, Australia has a much more generous approach, and for good or for bad. For example, Australians who were fighting with ISIS and their families are now being rehabilitated into Australian society. I think that's a pretty dangerous idea, but of course, I'm not Australian, and the custom here in Australia is much more inclusive and forgiving than the situation would be in the United States.
Okay, Pawan Chaturvedi, still enjoying banging of propagandist Rajdeep Sardesai.
I have nothing against Rajdeep. He's been nothing but great to me.
Okay, as I told you, his name. If you don't know about it, you can Google it. The Madison Square Garden boxer. Khan, Kiran, sorry, from East Hills, Sydney. Okay, next doors. Professor, thanks for staying so late on Saturday night. Why do you think these institutions did not even thought for a second that there may be questions raised on the integrity of these reports?
So first, Kieran, if you ever want to get together in Sydney, let me know. I'd always be happy to meet people, locals, for for a coffee or a lunch or a chat. Look, I think they're aware now that there are some problems in their India rankings, and so, for example, VDEM pulled back a little bit on its anti-India rhetoric after its 2020 report. The 2020 report and was extreme, and it seems to have been written by, well, at least someone with an Indian name was the co-author of the report, along with the head of the VDEM Institute. So it was probably drafted by that junior person who was a human rights activist, and I suspect VDEM may have understood after the backlash that it was had, that it put too much faith in a in a bright young idealistic employee who maybe pushed things too far. Now, I don't know. That's just a guess. I'm reading between the lines. Of course, they're not going to admit that, but I can see that potentially happened with VDEM in 2020. Look, I don't know if they're going to clean up their act. They, of course, survey people on more than 150 countries. Whether they take the India pushback seriously, or I don't know. They're not getting a lot of pushback from other countries. It seems to be very much a specifically Indian reaction to the rankings.
Okay, Professor, that brings us to the end of the questions, and we are about to end our session. Before that, I have to request once more to all those who are watching to please, before you quit, please like the video and please subscribe to us and also to support us. Thank you so much, all those who are watching, and thank you so much, Professor Salvatore Babones. You have been most patient, I think, even to some egregious questions. And so thank you very much. I think we'll meet more often. Thank you
I
so
love
much.
the egregious questions. Keep them coming.
Okay.